for those listening or tuning in later on demand who may not know anything about CT Vivian, we know that Nick just read a brief bio, but tell us a little bit more about who he was to set the foundation, if you will, for our discussion tonight.
Well, C.T. Vivian was a man of words and a man of action. Dr. Martin Luther King called him the greatest preacher who ever lived. And if you go to YouTube and listen to some of his sermons, I think you might agree with that. He also was a man of words in the sense that he was a great collector of African American literature dating all the way back to colonial times. He was a great reader and a great appreciator of literature. But first and foremost, he was a man of action, as the title of the book implies. For him, it was always about being in the center of things and trying to create change. And because he was born in 1924 and a little older than most of the other people that you might be familiar with from the movement, his activities in the civil rights movement started a lot earlier than some of the other names like John Lewis, Diane Nash, and so forth. He actually began with sit-ins in Peoria in 1947 to try and integrate the lunch counters and restaurants there. And then he continued all the way up through all the major battles of the civil rights movement in the South, which Nick just alluded to. And then he saw the North as the next battleground, came up to Chicago, which is where I live, in the late 60s, was here for several years, and then he returned to the South, where he was quite the visionary in creating the program that became Upward Bound, in creating the Anti-Klan Network to fight white supremacy in 1979, and in creating one of the first remote learning models in conjunction with Shaw University. So he was a thinker and a doer and a wonderful persuader.
You know, and I'll ask one more question, then we'll let Jim jump in. In reading your book, learning that born in 1924, his early education was all in integrated schools. Can you speak a little bit about that? And what, if any, you think that had in terms of an impact on his life's mission?
Right. Well, he was born in Boonville, Missouri, but when a fire destroyed the family home when he was 5 or 6 years old, his mother and his grandmother, who were great influences in his life, decided they wanted to move to a community where there would be integrated schools and where education would be at the forefront. So they moved to Macomb, Illinois, which, as you suggest, Renee, had an integrated school system, even though there were not that many African Americans in the school system. And while he encountered racism there, he also made a lot of friends, both in elementary school and in high school. But he did experience racism while a student. For instance, his French teacher told him that he should be the lead in the high school play, but because he was Black, he couldn't be that, and invited him to paint scenery. This is in 1942. And he had many white friends at the school, but they would tell him, "We wish we could have you over to dinner. We wish we could invite you to the parties that we're all going to, but because the color of your skin is different than ours, you can't." So he experienced positives with respect to his relationship with the white community, but he also experienced the kind of racism that existed in the North as well as the South at that time.
Steve Fiffer. I want to make real sure that we've got that correct starting out here, Steve. But I think one of the things that we, and I, in reading the book, came to know about him was the influence that women had in his life. You mentioned the strong influence in your comment just now about his mother and also his grandmother. Can you share more about that, and how did that sort of play itself out? And
Sure.
of course, someone else I want to ask you about very shortly about another woman, but those first two first.
Well, his mother and his grandmother were both divorced, and they raised him. His grandmother felt very strongly about the importance of education, as did his mother, and she started working with him on reading and mathematics when he was 4 or 5 years old. And the books that she exposed him to had a lot to do with the importance of his African-American heritage. One of the very first books that he read was a history of important African-Americans dating back to Crispus Attucks and others. And they, as we talked about, moved to a integrated school in an integrated community where there was a university to assure the fact that he would get a good education. And they both also felt very strongly about the importance of the church and introduced him to the church at a very early age. And of course, that was an influence for the rest of his life as well. But Jim, what I learned from talking with him and doing research and talking with the family was the importance of his wife, Octavia, and all the other wives and women that were central to the movement in the 1960s and the 1950s. His wife, Octavia, whom he was married to for almost 60 years before she passed away in 2011, had herself been an activist in Pontiac, Michigan, before they even met. They met in Peoria in the early 50s, but she had been working to integrate restaurants in Pontiac, Michigan before they even met, and she'd been active in voting registration drives before they even met. And when they got married and started having kids, and they had 6, she had to, as many spouses in those days, women in those days, stay home to raise the family. But she was his sounding board. He never did anything without her. The decision to go to seminary and the decision to go into a lot of the places where he was going to be risking his life. Because as Al Vivian, his son, has told me, said, you didn't get rich in the civil rights movement back in the 50s and 60s. We didn't have insurance. And so when people went off risking their lives, it was going to be left to the spouses to raise the families if these men didn't come home. And Octavia did a wonderful job of protecting the children and the family from knowing the danger that CT was in. They were not allowed to watch TV. She would watch TV and make sure that he was safe when he was away from home. But he always cleared going on the Freedom Rides or to St. Augustine or anywhere else with her before he went. And she made sure there was food on the table for the family while he was away.
Fascinating. It actually, though, brings to another question. And that is to say, then, what then moved him to a place, Steve, where his, I'm going to say, destiny, his calling, as it were, found itself somehow or another in the middle of this movement, whether it was in Peoria or whether now it went on to Nashville? What was your sense, and did he share, and the book kind of talks to this a little bit, I believe, but did he share kind of what was the thing that sort of moved him to that place? Did he have one of those pivotal moments? Did he have this epiphany that said, this is what I should be doing?
It's a really good question. He was always aware of his skin color. When I asked him, when were you aware of being black, being different from some of the other people in the community, he said, from the time I was born. And he was aware of the institutional racism and the personal racism that people of color faced in those days, having experienced it, as we discussed, to some extent in high school, and then even more so in college. But when he got to in college, he wasn't allowed to be part of the English club at Western Illinois University. A Harvard-educated professor who ran the club would not allow him to be in the club. And so he was aware of that. He was offended by that. And when he got to Peoria, he had the opportunity, really for the first time, to do something in an organized fashion because church there, a minister there, a white minister there in Peoria, was organizing these sit-ins at local restaurants to try and integrate the restaurants there. And once he was exposed to that, he just took to it. And then, of course, when he went to seminary and ended up in Nashville, he came in contact with Reverend Kelly Miller Smith and Jim Lawson, and the movement was there. That was really the center of the movement, as you know, at that time in the late 50s and 1960. And that's where he really found his calling.
Wow. Renee?
Yeah, I just wanted to take you back just for a moment when you talked about his grandmother and really seemingly instilling that love of books in him. And fast forwarding really more towards the end of your book and this library that he amassed, if you could share with the audience sort of the sheer numbers and the type of books that he and Octavia collected and how they collected in their trips. And I was fascinated by one of the books, I don't want to give, I'll ask you if you don't, but one of the authors in particular, very old, early.
Phyllis Wheatley. Yeah.
Right, from 1778.
Yeah.
Remember, yeah.
The first African-American poet to be published, woman in the United States. And I think he had a second edition of 18th century book that he wrote. Well, as you mentioned, his grandmother instilled this great love of books in him, and he was a lifelong collector of books. And from what the family tells me, and I mean, he told me about his lifelong interest in books, but Al Vivian, his son, has told me that when they used to travel around, CT had scoped out every antiquarian bookstore in the cities that they were visiting. And when they got off the plane, before they even got to their hotel, they would go to these bookstores because he knew what books those stores had. And so, Renee, over the course of his life, he and Octavia amassed a collection of about 6,000 books, sometimes just on family vacations, driving around the country to find bookstores where they could find these books, most of which dealt with African-American history or literature. And by the time of his passing, there were 6,000 or so of these books. And there is going to be a CT and Octavia Vivian library in a park that's being built in Atlanta. And these books are being donated. And the hope of the family is that tourists and other visitors will come to the library and see all of these wonderful resources. Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, all of these, wonderful African-American writers, relatively contemporary and dating back centuries.
Yes, I think I read in your book, first edition of some of Dubois' works. I mean, it's like amazing.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So, Jim.
Well, Steve, we've got him now established as this burn for this movement. He's in at this point in time in Nashville with all these other, I'm going to call them luminaries, because they were certainly there. And of course, you make the point that why did the stars align in such a way that all these people were there at the same place in a similar time in their life, vested in this, whatever they thought was going to happen. They obviously didn't know ahead of time, as it were, what was going to take place. Help me understand what that must have been like. Did he kind of share a little bit more about that? The book kind of talks about it a little bit, but I'm just trying to get your own impressions here. You know, what did he feel? Did he feel not only was he destined for this opportunity, but there was something special about it? Did he recognize that particular specialness of this moment?
Yeah, I think he did. I think he saw the opportunity. He felt Kelly Smith, Reverend Kelly Smith, was one of the most underrated figures in the civil rights movement, because he had been active in Nashville and helping establish it in fighting for integration and voting rights at the same time that Dr. King was doing that in other places. And he created with Kelly Miller Smith a chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the late 50s there. And then all these other young luminaries, as you put it, started arriving in Nashville. And I think once Jim Lawson started running these nonviolent direct action workshops is when they all realized that they were being equipped to go out and really change the world if possible. And in the book, this is my impression. We've seen the popularity of the musical Hamilton, in which there's a line about how could all these wonderful thinkers and revolutionaries be in the same place at the same time? Washington, Jefferson, Madison. But that's Nashville, 1960. Revolutionaries, thinkers, people, men and women of action, Nash, Bevel, Berry, Lafayette, Lewis, and Vivian. What an amazing group of people, all of whom trained under Jim Lawson and then went out and changed the world.
Well, he meets Dr. King. Did he share? Was it an instant moment of connectivity? Obviously, he was aware of Dr. King's work. Dr. King was also aware of his work. Was there this instant connection? And what happened to that particular point for which they knew they were locked arms, as it were, on this mission?
Dr. King was honored at Fisk in 1956, I believe. And that's where CT and Octavia met him for the first time and were immediately impressed. And CT's first reaction, CT was a kind of, as I said, he was a man of words. He was a somewhat of frustrated journalist. He always wanted to be a newspaper man. And when we first started talking, it was really funny. He said, "You've got the job I really wanted to have," and I said, "Oh, I'm so glad you took the job you did have," even though he was an excellent writer. But he and Octavia were so impressed by Dr. King when he came to Fisk that they interviewed him and wrote a lengthy article. CT was working, in addition to going to seminary, he was working for an American Baptist publishing company. But that publishing company thought that Dr. King was too radical to publish anything about at that time. So they published it on their own, CT and Octavia. But that connection was made, and Dr. King eventually saw CT speaking and preaching and realized that he could be an incredible asset to the movement. And eventually, when he joined the Southern Christian Leadership Conference as a coordinator, outreach person, they realized his value in going out to places like Selma, St. Augustine, and in a sense almost scouting the terrain to see if this was the right place for SCLC to dig in and create change.
There's one more point, and I'm going to ask my colleague to kind of pick up on this. And this is this issue of when the movement starts taking shape and why they chose Alabama as a place for which most of this would actually play out. He kind of talks about, obviously, the Birminghams and the Montgomerys and the Selma. Why Alabama?
Well, Alabama, the Nash and Bevel had gone to Alabama, and of course, Dr. King had roots in Montgomery, and but Nash and Bevel had gone to Montgomery. To Birmingham to start effecting change there with Reverend Shuttlesworth. In terms of there was already a foundation laid there for an effort with both integration of public facilities and a voting rights effort. SNCC was there as well. They just weren't making the kind of progress that the community in Selma was hoping for. And that's when SCLC got called in to engage in the voting rights movement in Selma. But as you point out, before that, they were involved in Birmingham, and that just was a city that had been seen as being ripe for effecting change. And Jim, one of the things when they chose some of these communities to get involved in, they needed a boogeyman in a sense. They needed someone like a Bull Connor in Birmingham or a Jim Clark in Selma to go up against, because they needed to portray that they were the forces of good going up against the force of evil, and the force of evil embodied in those big, beefy, mean, evil sheriffs who would do sick dogs on people, who would put fire hoses on people. And that forced people up in the north, that forced people in Congress to look and say, is this who we are? Is this who we want to be? So it was very important for them. They didn't want any of their people to be hurt or killed, to be sure, but they knew it was inevitable that there were going to be confrontations with folks like that were going to create situations that were going to be broadcast back up to the north, that were going to force people in positions of power to make moral decisions. In a sense, it's really interesting because, as you know, in those days there were only 3 television networks and their resources were limited, but they often captured on camera things going on, like Dr. Vivian being pushed down the courthouse steps in Selma in 1965, in one of the most iconic moments of the movement, his confrontation with Jim Clark. There just happened to be a network TV crew there that captured that. And when those images, just as the image of Bloody Sunday, got sent up on national television, it opened the eyes of a lot of people in the North. And the parallel I would draw today is the iPhone catching things on camera now that people wouldn't be aware of or wouldn't see if not for now amateur, just citizen journalists, citizen photographers or videographers.
Renee?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you raised so many good points. I wanted to talk a little bit about this notion of the confrontation, and your chapter is Segregation Christian. And if you could speak to us a little bit about that and how C.T. Vivian talked about using the Constitution and the Bible, Martin Luther King's framework, but sort of talk to us about those issues, those things.
Sure. Well, you took the phrase right out of my mouth, the Bible in one hand and the Constitution in the other. And in almost all of the confrontations that Dr. Vivian had with some of these authority figures, he challenged their Christianity. So let's talk about Nashville first. In Nashville student movement in April of 1960, sit-ins to try and integrate the lunch counters in the department stores in Nashville. African Americans were allowed to go into those stores, spend their money in the department stores. They weren't allowed to use the bathrooms, and they weren't allowed to use the lunch counters. So that's the first effort made by Jim Lawson's group of people, Diane Nash and C.T. and John Lewis and Bernard Lafayette and et cetera. And that culminates after several weeks of sit-ins with a bombing of the lawyer, Alexander Luby, who is representing the students who've been arrested for doing sit-ins. And that leads to C.T. and Diane Nash and Bernard Lafayette organizing what becomes the largest march of the contemporary civil rights movement at that time, 3,000 to 4,000 people marching on City Hall, where Dr. Vivian and Diane Nash play almost good cop, bad cop with the Mayor Ben West, and CT is the bad cop, and he is in Mayor West's face challenging his Christianity. How can you say you're a Christian if the Bible counsels us on one thing, but your behavior or your tolerance of something else is antithetical to the Bible? And that theme continues in Selma when Jim Clark pushes him down those steps. He gets up, and it is Bible in one hand and Constitution in the other. We have the right to vote, and it's not Christian of you to deny us the right to vote. So those were the dual references or marks that he always foisted upon his antagonists.
The other thing I wanted to, and it sort of goes hand in hand, I love the chapter 7 and 7, the disease of racism. And if you could talk about sort of how, again, that really all the themes are overlapping. That
chapter is largely about his belief that just because the Voting Rights Act had been enacted, that racism had not been eliminated. It was an epidemic. And he looked around and realized that it didn't just exist in the South. it was all over the place. That disease had spread everywhere. And he saw the North as the next battleground and moved up to Chicago, where he worked in training other members of the ministry to go back into their communities, more urban communities than rural communities in the North, to fight that disease. And so he worked in training ministers to go out to do that. And then he got involved in trying to integrate the unions in Chicago. And he worked in Chicago at the same time that Dr. King was working in an effort to integrate housing, because it was a disease, and it hadn't been eradicated just by the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And he really came to believe that it was going to take that they could march, they could get legislation, but it was going to take a change in the hearts and minds of white Americans before this disease was really eradicated. And case in point, we still have an epidemic.
Yeah, I have so many more questions, but Jim, please jump in.
This is actually a great line of question, Renee. And one of the things I wanted just to sort of maybe push a little bit further on is this whole idea that Dr. Vivian comes to himself about this realization of what you just said, Steve, in terms of what our community, our society had to do to get to a better condition of the community. Now, Dr. King, of course, coined the term beloved community, but clearly that's what he was talking about. But it was a process for Dr. Vivian. And at this point in time, it would seem to me that your book suggested that by the time he kind of gets to Selma, and he says according to your book that he wasn't even sure what he was going to say then to Jim Clark. It just sort of just came out.
Right, right.
And to talk more about that.
Well, when Jim Clark pushed him down the stairs, and with such force that Clark ended up breaking a finger or a knuckle of his own, pushing Dr. Vivian down the stairs, CT knew one thing, that he had to get back up and confront him. May I read a little section about what he told me about that?
Please.
Okay. Here's what he said, and this is from the book. This is what he said to me in describing why, after being pushed down the stairs by Jim Clark while attempting to register voters in Selma, that he got back up and confronted Jim Clark. It becomes very clear that we can never allow evil to destroy the forces of righteousness, even when beaten down. I had to get back up because otherwise people would have been defeated by violence. We can never allow violence to defeat nonviolence. There can be no questions unanswered. The depth of the human consciousness must be told. With Jim Clark, it was a clear engagement between the forces of the movement and the forces of the structure that would destroy the movement. It was a clear engagement between those who wished the fullness of their personalities to be met and those that would destroy us physically and psychologically. You do not walk away from that. This is what movement meant. Movement meant that finally we were encountering on a mass scale the evil that had been destroying us on a mass scale. You do not walk away from that. You continue to answer it. It does not matter whether you are beaten. That's a secondary matter. The only important thing is that you reach the conscience of those who are with you and of anyone watching. both the so-called enemy and those who are preparing the battle and anyone else who may be watching.
Steve, I mean, that's a grasp on a concept that has gone beyond just being able to articulate that to where this is taken on a whole living being, as it were, in terms of expression and so forth. And so that transition had to be important to him. And it appears then shared by others in this circle of folks who were positioned for this moment in time.
Exactly. And I think the roots of that came from their training with Jim Lawson in Nashville. In fact, there's a couple of quotes from Diane Nash, even from the prior to Selma, when the Freedom Riders were being beaten. There was a lot of discussion about whether or not it was safe to continue with the Freedom Rides in 1961. And this kind of same philosophy of we can't back down, you confront it, existed then. And it's really what moved these folks. And what's really amazing to me is the preparation that they had to be able to withstand some of the things that they ended up having to withstand, the physical harm directed towards them. And as we talk about in the book, in the workshops that Jim Lawson ran, they went through role playing so that they could be ready to be beaten. They had activities where people literally put cigarettes out on each other because they knew that kind of abuse was going to happen to them when they were out in the real world. And so they were very much prepared for this and ready to confront and not walk away.
Renee?
Yeah, it's just, in reading your book and hearing you say this again, it's the same thought. And I wonder, how many of us today would go into battle knowing that the likelihood of grave injury would occur and still be willing to go to fight for this thing that we're all fighting for, It takes such courage and dedication and selflessness, so it's sobering.
It's very, excuse me, yeah. It's extremely sobering when you think about in his situation in particular, that he had a wife and 5 or 6 children at home who were possibly going to be left on their own if something happened to him. And not to take away anything from the other people, but as we were talking about a little before we went on the air here, he was 15 years older or so than the John Lewises and Diane Nashes. So he already had a family when he was going out on the Freedom Rides. Doesn't take away anything from them about how they put their lives on the line. But the stakes were really high for him and his family when he was out there doing this. And I think that's one reason why, even though he may not be as well known to some people as John Lewis and some of the other people who rightfully are considered heroes and very well known, that people who have really studied the movement really appreciate them. And I think in the book we have an anecdote that I think really encompasses that. And this is 2007 in Selma during a commemoration of the anniversary of Bloody Sunday. And at that time, candidate Obama is addressing a crowd, a group of people gathered in Brown Chapel, which was kind of the staging area for Bloody Sunday, and is itself an iconic building in the history of the movement. And Obama has been given a list of many of the dignitaries that are there. And when he gets up to talk, he recognizes some of the bigger names in the movement who are gathered in Brown Chapel. And then he departs from his prepared remarks or the list of people who he's been told he should recognize. And he looks out in the audience and he sees sitting very humbly, just in the middle, not in any VIP or dignitary section, Dr. Vivian. And he points and says, "Do you see that man back there? That's Dr. C.T. Vivian. Dr. King called him the greatest preacher that ever lived. And without him, we wouldn't be here this day." And so I think that there's a real appreciation for what he did from people in the know. And what we're hoping is that this book expands that appreciation of him. And all at the same time, in talking about the man, because his activities spanned a little longer than some of the other people that we've been talking about, we get a kind of real history of the movement itself from the 1940s all the way up to the present.
Yeah, I was struck also by your chapter, "The Prophets Never Stop Serving," and how he talked about Martin Luther King being a prophet and placed in that time to give us a roadmap for the 21st century. And I wonder, in your reflections, spending time with C.T. Vivian, what are your thoughts about his calling? And, he would not call himself a prophet, no doubt, but what are your thoughts about, the uniqueness of what he brought to the movement and his importance, and sort of the whole history of then and now?
It's a really good question, Renee. And I think that what I see is a person who part of me wants to say he adapted to the particular times, but the other part of me wants to say he was a visionary who kind of shaped new approaches to the times he was in. So he, in the 60s, is dealing with the racism, the need for legislation. And then he comes out of Selma and starts thinking, okay, what's next? And what's next is the fact that there have been a whole number of young people who dropped out of school to join the movement, who need to be educated. And that leads him to create vision, which becomes upward bound. Then, okay, what's next after that? There's a whole group, the North is going to be the next battleground. I've got to go there and deal with the situation there. What's next? Okay, there are a whole bunch of people who want to be seminarians, who want to go out and change the world but can't come to university. Let's create a remote learning situation for them. Predates today's remote learning by 40 years. What's next after that? I see white supremacy as a big problem. In the late 1970s, people think the Klan is toothless. People think white supremacy is not a big deal. No. Anti-Klan Network, Center for Democratic Renewal, 1979. What's next after that? I see business. I see the corporate world. I see government as places where diversity and inclusion need to be taught to the people in power. And he creates an organization, BASIC, that's the name of the company he created, that has become the leading company in training people in not-for-profits, private industry, and government. So he is a prophet in many ways. He prophesizes what's coming, but he's the most humble prophet you're ever going to run up against.
Jim, please.
Octavia says of CT, he gives long answers to short questions. You said
Right.
the book.
I think I'm the same way.
So go a little further with that. How have you been affected by your research, the conversations with Dr. Vivian? Are you the same person you were before this began? And if you're not, how has that change come about? And describe for us you today, having completed this work.
Well, let me answer the last question first. This has been the most fulfilling professional experience of my life, and that's because I think it's really important to bring the story of this man's life to the public. I've helped, I've collaborated with a number of other prominent people on their memoirs or biographies. Morris Dees of the Southern Poverty Law Center, Secretary of State James Baker, a U.S. ambassador, and so forth. But their stories were fairly well known before I started working with them. In there's a pride and feeling of accomplishment on my part because I was able to help bring his story to light. What changed me in terms of my involvement in this project is realizing the grace and humility that can be combined with forcefulness and action. There's a yin and a yang about him that I think we all would do well to try and have inform our lives, this kind of thinking and action, grace, love, and still, doggedness and confrontation when necessary. So I think it's just kind of creating this holistic approach to going out and dealing with the forces of evil that still exist and not backing away from them.
Wow. We have so many questions, but we have about 6 minutes left. There is a question we wanted to take from the audience. Lorraine Griffin asks, why were so many movement leaders in Nashville in the 50s and 60s? And then can you talk more about why this city was important?
Why Nashville was important?
Right, and why were there so many movement leaders in Nashville in the 50s and 60s?
Well, they weren't leaders. They weren't necessarily leaders before they got to Nashville. They were leaders once they gathered together and took strength from each other and found mentorship or leadership and a particular cause under Jim Lawson and Dr. Vivian, who was older than the rest of them. And Nashville was important at that time because it was a southern city that seemed to be more enlightened than other southern cities at that time. It had many universities. in there. It was called the Athens of the South. It had a somewhat progressive city administration. And so it seemed to be a good laboratory to test some of the programs and some of the methods, like nonviolent direct action, that could be used in spreading out from there. But Diane Nash, when she came to Nashville to go to Fisk, she had no intention of getting involved in the movement. It was almost accidental. She was from Chicago originally. She'd gone to Howard. She came to Fisk, and for the first time, she really experienced the kind of racism, separate fountains, separate bathrooms that people in the South the African Americans in the South have been experiencing. She went to a state fair and couldn't use the bathrooms and the drinking fountains that everyone else used. And that is what triggered her involvement in the movement. And the others, I think they, there's Jim, you talked about the beloved community. There were people in the ministry who believed that the beloved community was something that was going to be experienced after we passed into another dimension. And there were others who wanted to create that beloved community contemporarily on earth, in the communities in which they lived. And that was the philosophy that was being taught in Nashville to the John Lewises and the C.T. Vivians and the Diane Nashes, the people, and either the people that were going to seminary at American Baptist Theological Seminary, like C.T. and John Lewis, or the people that were going to Fisk, like Diane Nash. And so Nashville just became the laboratory where a group of people with amazing talents all happened to be at once.
Fabulous. I know we all have so many more questions and we're actually out of time, but if you could in 30 seconds tell us why the name of the book.
It's in the action. It's just that despite being a man of words and loving literature, it was always the action for him. Interestingly, the family sent me some copies of sermons that he had given, and in the margins of so many of these, he's written to himself, "It's in the action. It's in the action." So that was something he stressed in his own life and to other people. You've got to get out there and do it.
I think that's a great way to end, and it's a lesson for all of us. It's in the action. From 60 years ago to now, there's so many parallels. It's in the action. Right. So, yeah, I'd like to thank you and Jim and Steve and Nick. We're out of time, so please take us out.
Well, thank you so much, especially to Steve Fiffer, which is the correct pronunciation, and apologies for the error earlier. We really encourage everyone to either borrow a copy of Steve's book with co-author with C.T. Vivian, the late C.T. Vivian, and it's available through the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. There's a link down in the chat for you. And also a great way to support authors like Steve who have taken time out of their schedule to share their work with us is to purchase a copy of their book if you are able to, whether it's for yourself or as a gift for someone else, or even as a gift for a library system. And you can do that through our partners at Loyalty Bookstores, which is a wonderful independent bookstore here in Maryland and DC. Our special thanks on behalf of everyone in Prince George's County goes to our wonderful friend and partner, Jim Stowe of the Montgomery County Office of Human Rights. We're grateful to you for all of your work in advancing our community and really demonstrating how all of us in Maryland work together to create a better life for each other. We, of course, thank our friends at the Prince George's County Human Relations Commission, Renee Battle Brooks and Kyla Hannington, and they will soon have a very cool name change, which is going to match very closely there to our friends in Montgomery County, so stay tuned for that. We extend thanks to New South Books from Alabama for helping make this event possible. And just before we leave, I want to plug a few of our upcoming events in this specific series with New South Books so that you can mark them on your calendar. On May 17th, we'll be joined by Steve Suits, who's going to discuss his book, Overturning Brown, The Segregationist Legacy of the Modern School Choice Movement. On June 7th, we'll have Christina Proenza-Coles, who's going to discuss her book, American Founders, How People of African Descent Established Freedom in the New World. And then on July 14th, we'll have Ken Woodley, who's going to discuss his book, The Road to Healing, A Civil Rights Reparations Story in Prince Edward County, Virginia. We also have numerous very important events coming up for Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, including fabulous debut author Eric Nguyen. We also have wonderful poet Kiran Kapoor and many others joining us in the next few weeks. So we are continuing to come at you with these wonderful virtual programs. And on top of that, starting our book discussion club with Washington Nationals first baseman Josh Bell on Sunday, May 23rd, where we'll be getting into topics around self-empowerment, leadership, and also advancing social justice. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to all of our partners. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Renee. Thank you, Kyla. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you to our friends who tuned in from all over the country. And special thanks to Lorraine for the great question. Good night, everyone.